Welcome to Season 3, Episode 13 of Read by the Author. Tonight we are continuing Time Anomaly. Let's get into the story. First off, one warning. This is a steamy episode, so without giving too many spoilers, it's a steamy episode, you've been warned. Part 6. Netjerat Oasis, 6th Dynasty, Old Kingdom. 32. Wives and Children. I stared at an enormous and rather unremarkable rock outcropping, wondering if, once again, something had been lost in translation. Maybe the word I had thought meant oasis actually meant huge mesa. Personally, I preferred my translation, and I really hoped it was still somehow accurate. I wasn't built for desert excursions. Under my protective linen robe and cowl, I was hot, sweaty, and pretty ripe, and I had been looking forward to glassy pools surrounded by palm trees, where I could take more than the barely useful sponge baths I had grown used to over the past week and a half. Hearing that the rocks ahead were in some way supposed to be the Netjerat Oasis had been a needle to my hopes, poking them and causing them to deflate in an instant. Heru was walking beside me as usual, and was silent, as had become usual. The cold shoulder mixed with his near constant close proximity was exhausting, and I had had enough. It was time to break the silence. Plus, I needed some clarification on the whole oasis thing. I said as much to Heru, adding, "So tell me, how is that the Netjerat Oasis?" I studied his profile as we crossed the final stretch of windswept sand separating us from the mammoth rock outcropping, along with the rest of our Netjerat human and donkey caravan. Heru continued looking ahead.
The rocks surround the oasis in a ring, like a protective wall.
He sent me the briefest sideways glance, and whatever he saw on my face, 1,000 shattered dreams, a you-kicked-my-puppy expression, absolute and utter disappointment, something along those lines, caused him to chuckle.
I do not wish to spoil the surprise, little queen, but do not fear. You will not be disappointed for long, I think.
I pursed my lips and narrowed my eyes. I hope you are correct, Heru. I really do. When we had crossed half the distance and were several hundred yards away from the tall wall of rock, a dark sliver came into view, an opening in the wall's face. The closer we drew, the taller and wider it seemed. Only when the first set of people and pack animals reached the opening did I realize just how big it was, wide enough for a half-dozen people to walk side by side, and at least twice their height. I figured Nguyen was in that first group, as he had taken the lead almost every day, while Heru seemed to prefer bringing up the rear. At the moment, only Aset, Nakure, Denai, and the other priestesses were behind us. Russ, who had been sleeping in his little sling, snug against my chest, awoke with a squeaky meow yawn and proceeded to stretch with such intensity that his little furry body shook. I pulled out the collar of my robe, peeking down at the kitten, and spoke to him in English. "Hey, little guy." He stared up at me with sleepy, squinted eyes and yawned again. "I think you're gonna get to stretch your legs soon. Maybe chase some bugs? How's that sound?" He started purring that loud, over-enthusiastic purr that belongs solely to kittens. It wasn't my words that were making him so happy. It was the hand I had tucked under the layers of pale linen so I could scratch under his chin. "But you have to promise to leave the scorpions alone, okay?" His eyes closed and he tilted his chin back, stretching out his neck. "I'll take that as a yes." We were nearing the opening in the wall of rock. It was too symmetrical to be natural, and inside the walls and floor were far too smooth. My heart rate picked up as my excitement made a resurgence. A nice, polished tunnel through a wall to somewhere was a lot better than a giant, solid rock.
You speak with little Russ quite often,
Heru said. I glanced at him. I have to speak to someone. It was an unnecessary jab, and I wished I could suck the words back in as soon as they flew out of my mouth. I was far from companionless, a set Nikure set Denai, the priestesses Nuin, but the one companion I desired above all others was out of my reach. And I knew he had a pretty damn good reason to hold me at arm's length, even if, with every breath, I wished he would pull me close, hold me tightly, and promise to never let me go. Heru didn't respond. He did, however, take hold of my arm and pull me to the side of the tapered opening before I could enter the tunnel. My hasty words must have irritated him as much as I'd feared they would. Apologies, Heru. I know this situation is difficult. He led me closer to the rock wall and stopped, stepping in front of me and watching the final few stragglers disappear into the tunnel. After a quick nod at someone behind me, he pushed his cowl back, and all of his attention was focused on me. Those molten golden eyes stared down at me. That chiseled jaw clenched. Those high cheekbones seemed sharper in the afternoon light, making him appear more wild and fierce and ancient, more other than usual. His appearance was a stark reminder that, even now, thousands of years in the past, it had been a long time since he'd been human. I fidgeted under the intensity of his stare, pulling both of my arms into my robe and petting Russ. I met Heru's eyes, but looked away almost immediately. Growing irritated at my deferential reaction, I forced myself to lock gazes with him. What is it? Why are you looking at me like that? Shaking his head, Heru let out a heavy sigh and almost smiled.
I would speak with you now, and I would have you say nothing until I am finished.
My eyebrows rose. Heru pushed back my own cowl, and I squinted as I lost the only thing shielding my eyes from the sunlight. He trailed the backs of his fingers over my cheek before pulling his hand away. It had been days since he'd touched me outside of training, and his fingers left behind a trail of tingles on my skin. I swallowed roughly, doing my damnedest to hide my reaction to that simple, restrained touch. My heart was racing, but I kept my breaths as even as I could.
There is much I would have you understand of my life here, of my life in general, and why the choice you have given me is such a difficult one,
he said.
But I fear that much of what I have to say will upset you, and whatever you may think of me, upsetting you is the last thing I want to do.
I could think of one thing he wanted to do less, bond with me, but I held my tongue. A humorless smile curved his lips.
Ah, but I see you do not believe me.
He shook his head again, laughing softly.
I cannot say I blame you, and now I shall risk driving you away completely. But I would have there be honesty between us, however bitter that honesty may taste.
I pulled part of my bottom lip between my teeth, and Heru's eyes flicked lower for the briefest moment. Honesty. I wasn't sure it was something we could have, not completely. I wasn't sure if I could tell him that Nuin would die before I left this ancient time, or that Set would be possessed by a pep, and the possession would last millennia. And then there was the whole twins issue. How would he react to finding out that thousands of years in the future we had to have children, and our children wouldn't exactly be normal? I had already turned his life upside down. I wasn't sure either of us could handle any further upsets. Not yet. Heru cleared his throat.
My other 2 wives, they are here, as are our children and many of my aging human descendants from past unions. I would have you meet them, have you learn something of the sacrifice I, and others, would be making should you and I truly be together.
I was shaking my head before he had finished speaking. There was no reason for him to give up any kind of relationship with his children, and where his wives were concerned, as much as it pained me to admit it, relations with them would return to normal as soon as I was gone. It would be as though I had never existed in this time. It had to be that way. But I stopped myself and squeezed my eyes shut in a protracted blink. Please continue, I said, and reopened my eyes. The faintest hint of a smile turned the corners of Heru's mouth upward.
Many Netjerot men value human women for one thing alone, their ability to bear our children.
He paused, his stare turning challenging.
I am not among them. I only take wives I genuinely care for, I genuinely desire, and I love them as best I can during the short time I have with them.
He did smile this time, a sad, wistful expression.
Their lives are so fleeting, but it is that very quality that helps me remember that every day matters, that every moment deserves my full attention.
As he spoke, I realized that, while I still felt extreme, wrenching jealousy toward every single woman he had ever been with, I also felt gratitude toward them for helping to shape him into the man I loved so desperately, a man who had been hardened by time, but who wasn't oblivious to its passing like so many of the ancients of our kind. His eyes searched mine.
Bunifer has been my faithful wife for 57 years, and in that time she bore me 8 children. 5 survived to adulthood, the youngest of which manifested 2 years ago. She is the first child of mine to do so in over a century. Bunifer is quite elderly now, and though our relationship has changed over the years, I still hold great affection for her and consider her one of my closest friends. I will mourn her passing for centuries.
His eyes shone with the love he felt for Bunifer, and tears pricked in my own eyes.
I believe she will like you very much. She and Aset have always been very close.
My eyes widened.
And then there is Seshet.
He exhaled heavily.
Sesha is, well, she is much like you in many ways. Pensive, guarded, filled with single-minded determination.
He smiled, and for once the expression touched his eyes.
And quite beautiful. We have been together for 19 years, and during that time she has given me 6 children, 4 of which remain with us.
He paused, but his eyes never left mine.
I would have you stay in my home with my family, with me.
Stunned, I opened my mouth but couldn't seem to find any words. All I could manage was to slowly shake my head. Stay in his home? With his family? His wives?
I have already spoken to Nguyen about this, and he is amenable, so long as you are. You would have your own private sleeping chamber, but this would also give us a way to come to know each other better, to understand how our lives and the lives of my family would be changed if we bonded.
Again he paused, and the skin around his eyes tightened minutely.
What do you say? Are you willing to try this?
I inhaled and exhaled several times, pondering how to respond while I studied every angle, every line of his face. On my 5th inhale, I did the unthinkable. I nodded. Very well. I am willing to try. Relief filled Heru's eyes and visibly altered his stance. His shoulders relaxed, his chin lowered, and his lips curved into a genuine grin. What did I just agree to? I adjusted Russ's weight in his sling, anxiety already rising. I wasn't ready for this, for meeting them. I felt the desperate need to delay and said the first thing that came to mind. But I would like to clean myself up before you take me to meet them.
There is a small bathhouse in my home. We could...
Before I meet them, Heru, and I need to fetch a fresh dress. He didn't miss a beat.
Your priestesses will no doubt be waiting for you on the other end of the passageway in the oasis. We will gather a clean dress from them before sending them on to my home with your belongings.
I felt my eyes go wide and my heart flutter wildly. This was all happening so fast. But...
And then I will take you to a small, secluded pool where you may bathe under the sun and...
I shook my head, feeling my chest tighten with rising panic. Heru,
Bunifer and Seshet will love you,
he said, reaching up to run his fingertips along my jaw and down my neck, curling his fingers around the back of my neck. And though his eyes were usually filled with a gleam of repressed longing when he looked at me, he was now letting the emotion show in his open expression. My breath hitched.
"And my children will love you,"
he said so very softly. Part of me expected him to declare his own feelings, to put my mind at rest by telling me, once and for all, he had decided to bond with me. It was the selfish, hopeful, and apparently delusional part of me. Ever so slowly, he leaned in, bringing his face closer to mine. His lips brushed across mine with the faintest pressure, just enough that I could feel them curve into a smile. I was afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to do anything that might shatter this moment. Heru pulled away just as slowly, the slight smile still curving his lips.
"Come, little queen."
He stepped around me, pausing at the mouth of the tunnel and looking back at me while holding out his hand. I maneuvered my left arm through the folds in my robe until my hand was free. Tentatively, I approached Heru and placed my hand in his. He grinned, his eyes crinkling at the corners and his irises sparkling with genuine pleasure. I had never thought of the skin between my fingers as an erogenous zone, but the slow, sensual way his glided between mine changed my mind completely. His grin turned sly, knowing, and just the tiniest bit wolfish. Oh, he knew exactly what he was doing and could read the effect he was having on me as clear as day. Even though he wasn't bonded to me, I was still fully bonded to him, and that made even the most benign touch feel decadent and rouse more than a hint of desire. Heat flooded my neck and cheeks even as things low in my abdomen tightened in misguided anticipation. I licked my lips, unable to break eye contact with him. Heru's pupils expanded, dilating with desire that mirrored my own, even if it was paler on his end due to our one-sided bond. His eyelids slid closed, and he inhaled deeply. He said a word I didn't know, but based on his harsh tone, I assumed he was cursing. When his eyes snapped open, his irises were almost entirely black. Just the thinnest circlet of gold surrounded his pupils. "You enjoyed teasing me in my time as well," I said, allowing a small smile. I raised my chin a little. "Be careful, Heru. Your self-control may be strong, but it is not limitless." His eyes narrowed, holding a glint of challenge.
"Perhaps you overestimate my desire for you."
I cocked my head to the side and barely held back a smirk. Mutual desire was one thing that had never been lacking between Marcus and me, and Heru being a younger Marcus, well, perhaps, but I do not think it would be wise to test that theory. Heru pressed his lips together in a thin line and made a rough noise low in his throat.
"Perhaps you are right,"
he said, starting toward the passageway and pulling me along beside him.
"Perhaps."
33. Over and over. As we plunged into the shadowed tunnel, I couldn't help but laugh, just as my heart couldn't help but beat too quickly. Cooler air enveloped me, and I sighed in relief. Shade, like water, was a rarity in the Sahara, and I basked in the momentary lack of sunshine. Up ahead, the other end of the passageway was a point of brightness that expanded quickly as we walked. Through it, I could see sunshine and greenery and, as Heru had predicted, the silhouettes of 3 women, the Hathor priestesses who had all but begged to stay with me, despite claiming to believe that I wasn't actually their goddess. I still wasn't completely convinced. I couldn't see much beyond the shield of date palms and low desert shrubs that sprouted a few yards beyond the tunnel's exit. It was almost like they had been planted there on purpose, to block unwelcome, unexpected visitors from catching a glimpse of whatever lay beyond them in the oasis. Knowing Nguyen and his slight flair for eccentricity, I figured the Netjar'at homeland would be populated by structures at least as unique as the people who inhabited them. I nodded to myself, certain that the thick shield of palms had been placed strategically. As Heru and I emerged from the passageway, Denai smiled and bowed her head. "We will accompany you to Nguyen's residence, Alexandra. I am sure you wish to bathe and rest." Her eyes slid to Heru, lingering on our joined hands, and she arched an eyebrow. "And you must wish to return to your home, Heru." However loyal she was to me, she didn't wholly approve of all the time I spent with Heru. I thought it was less because I was being potentially unfaithful to my husband, and more because of Heru's past relationship with Ankhesenpepi, who Denai seemed to despise, as did almost every other woman I had spoken with, aside from Nguyen's primary human wife, Ipwet, who I tried to avoid as much as possible. I offered Heru a weak smile. "Actually, Denai, I will be staying at Heru's home." Denai's face transformed, going from disapproving to flabbergasted in an instant. I choked on a laugh, coughing and barely holding back a grin. "I just need a clean dress." Straightening her back, Denai held her head high. "I see. And what of us? Where would you have us stay?" Heru cleared his throat.
"You are more than welcome to stay in my home as well." The corner of his mouth twitched. "That way you can continue to protect Alexandra's virtue."
Denai ignored his barb and returned her attention to me. She had relaxed, and the usual good-natured sparkle had returned to her eyes. "Would this please you, having us remain there with you?" "Very much, Denai." I scanned the two other young women, Sia and Kemi, and smiled. "Very much indeed." And I meant it. I was nervous as hell about moving in with Heru, two of his wives, and his brood of kids, and having the priestess's familiar faces around would do a lot to ease my nerves. Plus, I simply enjoyed their company. They were loyal, trustworthy, and kind women I had come to consider close friends. Sia, who, as soon as I had requested fresh clothing, had started rummaging around in a bundle attached to one of the 3 donkeys lounging nearby, handed me a rolled-up dress of fine white linen. A moment later, she added the belt Denai had made from some of the turquoise and quartz beads that had come from my destroyed bead net dress, and my pair of turquoise and gold-embellished leather sandals. Kemi fished through another bundle, pulling out a jar of the paste that passed as soap in this time, a mixture of natron and ash very similar to what I used every morning and evening to clean my teeth. I accepted the offerings with a smile and murmured thanks. "Are you certain you do not want to accompany us and wash up there?" Denai's hands were on her hips, and she was making a really valiant effort not to eye Heru suspiciously. "Yes, Denai, I am sure," I said, laughing softly. "I would very much like to make a good first impression." She sighed dramatically. "Very well. We shall inform Heru's wives of your imminent arrival and aid them in setting up our quarters." She bit her lip. "But I hope you will not take too long."
"She will take as long as she takes," Heru said, tugging on my hand as he stepped toward a downsloping, palm-lined path that ran along the rock wall. My kitten chose that moment to start kneading my chest. I slipped my hand free of Heru's, earning a raised eyebrow and parted lips, and looked at Denai. "Will you take Russ? I am certain he is starving, not to mention dying to run around." Denai grinned. She loved the little furball almost as much as I did. We made the exchange with a lot of help on her part, considering everything I was holding, and I gave her my thanks before rejoining Heru. He watched me with guarded eyes as I approached. I stopped in front of him, studying his face and trying to puzzle out the reason for his sudden reticence. Behind me, I could hear the priestesses and donkey making their way along another of the paths leading away from the mouth of the tunnel. "So, where is this pond you mentioned?" Heru continued to stare at me, a million thoughts seeming to whirl around in his eyes. "Heru?" I touched my fingertips to his forearm. "Is something wrong?"
Exhaling, he shook his head.
I thought...
He cleared his throat.
For a moment I thought perhaps that you had changed your mind, that you would choose to stay at Nguyen's residence instead. I have never felt so...
Again he shook his head, his brow furrowed.
It does not matter.
He took hold of my hand once more, the gentle slide of his fingers between mine just as sensual as it had been before.
Come, I will show you the most perfect hidden pool for washing. You will love it, I think.
At this point, a tub of water behind a boulder would have looked like the most perfect hidden pool for washing. I snorted as he led me down a path lined with limestone, reaching up toward the clear blue sky on one side and a mass of date palms and shrubs on the other. But my mouth fell open as we rounded a curve and the secluded hideaway came into view. Heru had brought me to a small spring surrounded by limestone boulders that seemed to have been artfully arranged around the water, and the tiniest burbling waterfall trickled into a wide pool that glittered with sunlight. It really was the most perfect hidden pool. It looked like it had been relocated from some fairy tale land into the heart of the Sahara. "How is this real?" I said, laughing in wonderment as I stared around. He had been right. I loved it. And if it was any indication of what the rest of the oasis was like, I was almost tempted to forego washing up in favor of getting a good look at the rest of the place. Almost. I tore my eyes away from the delicate waterfall and looked at Heru. It is perfect. This place. He smiled, genuine pleasure gleaming in his eyes. Releasing my hand, he reached for the items I was carrying and set them on a low, flat boulder beside the pool. And then he returned to me and started unwrapping the thin fabric looped loosely around my neck. He tossed what had been my cowl onto the ground before taking hold of the sides of my multi-layered linen robe. My hands found his wrists, gripping them tightly as I held them in place, and I looked up into his darkening eyes. "What are you doing, Heru?" He raised his eyebrows, feigning casual unconcern, but nothing could hide the desire, the challenge in his eyes.
"I am merely helping you disrobe so you may bathe."
Staring at him, I held his wrists for a moment longer, and then I let go. My robe, more a sun and heat protectant than anything else, was pulled over my head and had joined the cowl on the ground within seconds. I stood before Heru in a thin, white linen shift that had been clean when I had donned it that morning, and the supple leather slippers I had been wearing throughout the 11-day journey, wondering if he would attempt to remove the rest of my clothing as well. He took a step backward and started attending to his own overlayers. They landed on the rocky ground beside mine, but he didn't stop there. He toed off his own hide moccasins as he worked on unknotting his linen kilt. I couldn't move, couldn't tear my eyes away from him. I could barely breathe. Watching him was the only thing I was capable of at that moment. My breaths came too fast, like I was doing something strenuous instead of just standing there, staring at him as he undressed and loving every single nanosecond. Not that he seemed to mind. His eyes never left mine, never judged, only promised. At least, I hoped they promised. He dropped his kilt on top of the pile of discarded linen garments and stood before me, completely nude. And he said nothing. He watched me watch him, watched me taking in the sight of him. His expression went through a play of emotions, starting with curiosity and eagerness, only to move on to excitement and desire. To need. His chest, like mine, was rising and falling too quickly.
"Alexandra, please."
His voice was hoarse, asking, demanding. Returning my gaze to his, I removed my shoes, then crossed my arms in front of me and gathered my shift at my hips. I pulled it over my head in one smooth motion, eternally grateful to the priestesses for being so gung-ho about hair removal. The ancient Egyptians were not fans of lice, and made sure to eliminate as many habitats for the little buggers as possible. What had been a few moments of stinging pain led to a shorter, if more memorable moment of absolute glee. The gleam in Heru's eyes as he scanned me, his body's response. At this point, I was ready to kiss all of the priestesses. I was so grateful. I raised my chin and squared my shoulders. Oh, he definitely seemed to enjoy that. Are you going to get into the water? Heru's lips twitched as his gaze heated.
After you.
He held out his arm toward the crystalline pool. Smirking, I shrugged and showed him my backside, slowly making my way to the pool. It was nothing he hadn't seen before. Or rather, wouldn't see later. The water felt heavenly, the perfect Goldilocks temperature, and I groaned as it reached my hips. My smirk grew when I heard the water splashing behind me. I stopped when it was waist-high, but didn't turn around.
Perhaps you were right about my self-control,
Heru said,
his voice rough.
Perhaps? The water lapped against my back as he moved closer.
Perhaps that is your intention.
Laughing, I shook my head. Bathing here? Like this? That was your idea. Do not presume to blame me. Suddenly, Heru's hand was on my hip, sliding to my stomach. The front of him was pressed against the back of me. And damn me to an eternity of torture by a pep set if I didn't almost lose myself to pleasure in that moment. I could be so pathetic sometimes.
But I do blame you, little queen.
His breath was hot against my ear, just as he was hot against my backside, making the water feel cool in comparison.
I blame you for making me desire what only you can give me more than I have ever desired anything from another being, Netjerot or human.
His other hand slipped up my ribs until he cupped one of my breasts. I gasped as his finger pulled and twisted tender flesh without mercy.
I blame you for making me want to know your mind as much as I want to know your body.
I reached behind me, taking him in hand and savoring his sharp inhale as my thumb slid along his hard length. I closed my eyes, thinking nothing had ever felt so good. I was so very wonderfully wrong. Heru's hand glided lower on my abdomen, moving completely underwater, finding my most sensitive places for the first time. I gasped and moaned in his hold, and for minutes he did the same in mine. It was the most intimate we could be without actually initiating full-on bonding. Heru! I reached up with my free hand, hooking it around the back of his neck. Heru, you have to stop. You have to stop this before it goes too far.
You stop it, he said, his voice barely a rasp, and I melted completely. Pleasure overwhelmed me, and based on his sudden rigidity, overwhelmed him as well. For dozens of breaths we stood in the water, clinging to each other, until finally our bodies went limp and boneless. I arched my back against him as I felt his arousal resurge, and I forced my fingers to unclench from around him. Let go, Heru. What?
This will continue over and over again. You must let go. I squirmed in his hold, flailing a little.
How long does it go on?
It never stops, I said. He still held me, my body tensed, my muscles ready to flee. His voice was barely audible when he spoke.
Never?
I shook my head.
How do you handle it? The wanting.
I laughed hoarsely. How do you think? There was only one thing that made it bearable, and it was the one thing he wasn't ready to give me. His answering groan, his clenching hands, were enough to make me melt all over again.
We should finish washing up,
he said. Yeah, I rasped. We should. Thanks for listening. I will be back next week with the next part of the book. Until then, happy reading!